Today I'm breaking down Taylor Swift's Elizabeth Taylor to uncover just how that dark, cinematic pop sound came together. Hey, my name's Chris. I've worked on multiple major label projects with the likes of Sony, Universal, The Voice, Australian Idol, and a bunch more. But what actually stood out to me here is how minimal the production actually is, yet it still feels huge. The truth is, most producers chase things like loudness and polish, but Elizabeth Taylor really proves that space and restraint can make a track hit harder than any plugin could. So in this breakdown, I'm going to show you exactly how I rebuilt the key parts, from the aggressive drums to the haunting pianos and layered strings, and break down why each element works, not just how it was made. And by the end, you'll understand how to create this kind of cinematic depth in your own tracks. And my goal is to give you all of the tools and techniques that you need to level up your productions. So let's dive in, but first, here's the example.
Cry my eyes violet, Elizabeth Taylor. Tell me for real, do you think it's forever? Been number one, but I never had to. And I can't have fun if I can't have be my NY when Hollywood hates me. Only as hot as your last hit, baby. Been number one, but I never had to. And I can't have fun if I can't have you.
So we're going to start at the very top with these aggressive drums. But what's actually giving the drums its character here isn't quite what you'd expect. So I'm going to take you from the very top, starting with the kick. This is what it sounds like in isolation. So we've got a couple of layers going on here, starting with a very basic sub kick. And then I've got this little stomp layer that I'm putting underneath it. Now, it's a little more prominent on the original record, but I think for this mix that I sort of ended up with, I needed something a little bit more subtle. So in isolation, this is what it sounds like. And you can find that exact stomp sample and a bunch like it in my sample pack linked below. And that's really all that's making up the kick at this point. So aside from that, we've got a very small reverse kick. That's not on the record, but I just thought it sounded really cool. Added a little bit of punch to that entry point. So as for the processing, I've taken out just a little bit of the lows here, bumped up a bit of the fundamental, as I always like to do, just using a bit of dynamic EQ, not a whole heap. It acts almost like a transient designer to just give it that punch on that specific frequency. I've then dipped out around sort of 376 and then boosted just over 1K. And for all of these, we're using dynamic EQ. I've then got smack attack. The mix is around halfway because I don't like to kind of ruin the original character of the kick that I normally have. So I've added some attack here. And another thing I really like to do is just turn down the sustain. So it just adds to that snappiness and just takes off some of the length. So on the kick group where I'm processing both the sub kick and the room kick together, I've got some soft clipping, which is pretty intense. I've really rounded out those peaks. And this is what it looks like in action. And the reason I've done that is to just give it some more energy while giving it the volume boost that I want to. Then I've gone ahead and added drum bus. I've got some drive and crunch all the way up, along with the transients. The reason for that is that I've got this in parallel, so it's only at 1.6% on my kick drum group. So it's almost as if it's not doing anything, but I definitely hear a difference. You can just hear it adding to those transients and sort of lifting the hairs on some of those frequencies with the drive. So before soft clipping, this is what it sounds like. And then with. So it's fairly subtle, but I really find that it helps it sit in the mix and just mesh with the basses a little better, not to mention the character that it also gives it. So right after that, if we go ahead and add drum bus, you can really hear that sharp attack start to pop through. So moving on to the snares, the next section of the drums I'm going to show you is definitely what caught my ear in the first place. And I think what really gives the drums in this track its impact. So that is the snare. Now, it's not quite your conventional snare. What they've actually used is more of a drum machine clap. So this is what it sounds like by itself. I think this sound in Kontakt sounds really, really cool. Whenever I've used it on something or whenever I've heard someone else use it on something, it always just carries so much power. Now, it might sound a little bit thin on its own, but there's one thing you can do just to really give it some body, give it some depth. So you can do this by adding a gated reverb. So I've got H-verb here set to around 6 for the decay, and then I've got a gate that's driving straight to that machine clap. So we essentially want to tell the gate to shut at a certain point. And we do this by adjusting the threshold and then tweaking it with the hold and release. So with those settings, I got to this. And then without. And just to show you exactly what it's doing, I'll show you without the gate. So it kind of gives you the body of a really long reverb, but you're able to control the length with the gate. So another thing that I really did just to kind of enhance the body underneath that clap was layer it with a fairly basic snare, which sounds like this. Now, of course, it doesn't sound like a conventional snare here. Basically, what I've done is take out a lot of that kind of top end. I then used torque just to really pitch it down, just to change where it was sitting on the frequency spectrum. And this is what really gave it its body. So definitely using something like torque is a great way to manipulate your drum sounds and really get something polished and ready to use. So right after torque, I used a bit of smack attack, actually quite a bit more than I expected. We've got the mix all the way to 79 and we've boosted the attack. So we've really got this thump that's sitting underneath that clap and they complement each other perfectly because, of course, that machine clap is closer to a white noise sort of sound, comes across a lot higher on the frequency spectrum, and then you've got this sort of more muted drum that just kind of acts as basically a solid foundation for that clap. And so there are a few sort of one-off claps and snare sounds that happen in the track, and this is what the first one sounds like. And then one right underneath that. So more of an organic clap mixed with a verbed out electronic clap. So that combination can be really nice too, mixing organic and electronic sounds. And note that they're not happening on every single hit. They're happening on the very first snare of around every 2 bars. And it's those little highlights, those moments that can really just give a track its identity, and it acts as a sort of ear candy. So it keeps the listener interested and adds that impact only here and there. So altogether, when that clap comes in, this is what the drums sound like. So next up, we've got some really subtle percussion, and if you really listen to this mix, you can hear that it's not that prominent. The star of the show here is really that machine clap and the massive kick. So what I've done here is use a really simple loop just from Echo Soundworks, and this is what it sounds like. And as you can hear, there's some variety in the hit. It's not just a straight hi-hat sample. Whenever you can try and find that sort of variety in your loops, or even when you're crafting a sort of hat section, definitely aim for that variety. It just adds so much more interest. So right underneath that, as for percussion, we have these little snare rolls. And again, just something to add that kind of rhythmic momentum. It really pushes the song forward. And whenever you can do little ghost notes like this, it can make a huge difference. So this is what they sound like by themselves. And for this, I've just taken a very dry live drum sample, and I've added just a touch of EQ, a little bit of RC20, just on Drum Breaks 3. That is a great preset if you want sort of filtered drums and just adding some interest that way. And that's really all I did. And then I just kind of mimicked what it was doing on the record. The very next thing that you'll hear is a very light ride cymbal, and it sounds like this. So nothing too complicated rhythmically there, but I think it's playing a really important role in kind of adding a sort of live feel to this track. It also hits on the same beat as the snare, which can just add a little bit more of that splash and a little bit more of that impact. So although it's really subtle, it can do a lot. It's even sort of playing underneath that kick, which can also just give it a little bit of a boost whenever it hits on beat 1. So lastly, on the drum group, I'll show you the 3 main plugins that I'm using. I've got Drum Bus once again in parallel, and it's affecting it differently here because, of course, this is the entire drum group. It's not just an individual element. So how it reacts to, I think, multiple drum sounds is different to how it'll react to one. So that's the first thing that I use, and I just add a little bit of drive, a little bit of crunch, and again, introducing a touch of those transients. I've then got T-Rex Classic Clipper. It's my favorite clipper for drums. I've got the slope all the way to the left, a little bit rounder. I've pumped it up to 8. And again, I probably could have gain staged this a little bit better. And lastly, this is not something that I do all the time, but it can be a really useful trick if you feel that your drums need it. Just using an imager of some kind and really kind of narrowing that low end, I find that works really well, just to ensure that any of that sub is staying in the middle, nothing sticking out to the sides necessarily, just a preference of mine. And then just kind of widening the mid-range a little bit can do a lot just to add a little bit more dimension to your drums. So those drums are only one element of this entire track. And of course, they wouldn't move the same without a really well-crafted bass line. Instead of my sort of usual go-to of maybe choosing an 808 sub or something like that, and then maybe layering it with something else, I've actually gone with a Rickenbacker bass. I notice that the bass in this track is fairly rhythmic. It's not hitting like a usual sort of 808. It sort of plays like as if someone's played it in, which I wouldn't be surprised if they have. So this is what it sounds like in isolation. So I'm using a little bit of dynamic EQ and I've hooked it up to the kick where it's subtly ducking out the frequencies that are clashing with that kick. So I've got it hooked up through here, I've chosen my kick, and basically it feeds through to here. So if we have a look at the kick in isolation with the bass, so as you can see, I've just spotted these two sort of fundamental frequencies from the kick, and I've done just a very light scoop from that bass, just to ensure there's no real clashing. I wanted to prioritize the kick there in that particular area. I've also rolled off a lot of the top because I found that the bass I was using on the record was rather mellow, so it didn't have sort of a lot of that top end. Right after that, I added some saturation, as I normally like to do on basses or on 808s or anything like that, just in parallel, not too much, not even halfway, and just really crank that drive a little bit. I've also engaged the soft clip function. I've then tightened up some of the mid-range on the multi-band compressor and then just pumped it up a little bit, which again just acts like a transient designer. I did have this on as a bit of a preset, so I probably don't need it because I did roll off a lot of that initially, so it doesn't really make sense to try and boost it again. And then of course I've got R-Bass, which is really adding those sub-harmonics so you can hear it on smaller speakers like a laptop or on a phone, and you can just interpret the sub that little bit better on smaller speakers. So next we're going to move on to what really makes this track and almost sound like it's a part of a film score. So I'm just going to show you that instrumental in isolation. So this is a really cool arrangement and definitely, I think, not a conventional one. There are things sort of moving all over the place and they're not consistent bar to bar type of lines. So the first thing that I want to show you is this little piano arpeggio. This is what it sounds like in isolation. So it's really, really nice. I just sort of sounded out the arpeggio here. It looks more or less like a C-7 chord, and I don't think it has to be perfect. The key is just to ensure that these are all spaced out with every note a little bit further to the right. And you really do want to experiment with where some of these notes sit because you can get a really nice drawn out version of this, or you can get a really sort of quick and snappy one. So definitely experiment with it. I definitely had to play around with it to try and get the right feeling. And so what I did after that was add a higher octave, and it sounds like this. So I didn't have that initially, but I think particularly on live instruments, just a higher octave can make a big difference, especially in the context of a mix like this. So right after that, we've got another really cool element that just kind of brings it into more of a modern space. Like you're not expecting it until you kind of hear it. It's a slightly different sound I've got here to what you'll hear on the record, but this is what it sounds like. Now this only fades in here and there. Again, I didn't replicate it exactly, but I've just placed it at the end of every couple of bars in the place where I sort of heard it pop out the most. And what I'm using here is just a really, I think maybe even a stock Serum sound just under pads. In fact, it was the very first sound that I tried. I was using Massive and a couple of others, but just sort of landed on this one. I think it complemented it really nicely. And one thing that I've done that you should definitely consider with little ear candy elements like this, little synths and things like that, is simply automating the volume. It can do so much to really give your tracks that sort of energy. And the way I've done that is with the utility plugin. Always try and use that over volume automation. It'll definitely save you down the line because if you automate the volume knob and then you want to change it later, it's going to be really difficult. So doing that with utility can definitely save you a lot of headache down the line. One of the key moments in this chorus, I think, is definitely that string line. I'm certain they would have had someone play this in, and I didn't follow every single articulation, but again, it's more just the principle to show you what a simple line like this can actually do to a chorus. You don't hear this the whole way throughout. As you can see, it's only every sort of bar 2 and bar 4. And just underneath that vocal, massive difference, and adds just that really sort of film score-esque tone to it. This is what it sounds like in isolation. And so what I've done there is essentially double a piano with a violin. They may have had another synth in there. And so what I did to compensate for that was just add a little synth kind of playing the fifth of every note. Again, just mixing the organic with more of the electronic stuff can just add so much depth to a mix. So the next layer is the violins. And of course, they've got those amazing slides and things like that, which I didn't do in this particular version, but I think definitely worth kind of drawing in that sort of automation when you're using strings in general. And then we've got the piano. Again, I'm using both octaves for the piano and violin, alongside some thirds to accompany it. So maybe think about some very simple melodies that you can play underneath your vocal melody. It can just add so much interest and just really drive the track forward. And lastly, from this instrumental section, we've actually got these block chords. Again, they're very disjointed. They're sort of played here and there, but this is what they sound like. So that might not be exactly it, but it's pretty similar to the sort of rhythmic piano in the background that you can sort of hear in this track. And that's really just sort of padding. That's just the midsection that can really fill it out, because without that, I think the track would be pretty sparse. Everything here is really intentional. And I think the more you can kind of think about these elements and just creatively place them to add that interest to your track, the cooler the result. But of course, you'll have to be careful not to overdo it, because if they're not done right, or if they're sort of overused throughout the track, they can just sort of create a bit of a mess. So definitely use them sparingly, but nevertheless, something you can use in your next arrangement. So the very last thing I've got here is just an organic cymbal. And little to no processing, a lot of the work is sort of done in the sample. I think if you're choosing a live cymbal like this, just definitely choose something with that sustain that sort of has those overtones as it rings out. And of course, this is by That Sound. Really great samples if you're looking for something a little more organic. So here's the whole demo in its entirety.
Cry my eyes violet, Elizabeth Taylor. Tell me for real, do you think it's forever? Been number one, but I never had to. And I can't have fun if I can't have me, my, and why. When Hollywood hates me, only as hot as your last hit, baby. Been number one, but I never had to. And I can't have fun if I can't have you.
Thanks for watching, and if you want me to personally coach you so you can start producing and releasing your best tracks yet, click the link below to book a free call with me. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.